And hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation of OTF Connects, Moving Beyond the Curriculum Checklist with Aviva Dunziger. And we're very excited to have you all here after a long weekend. And we thank you for giving up some of your time. And on behalf of Sirius Gerhan and everyone at OTF, we're just thrilled that OTF Connects continues to meet your needs. And we're always happy to have your feedback. And we're going to make sure you have a link at the end of the session so that you can do that. And once again, we've got teachers from across the province joining us tonight. And of course, we do want to say thank you as well to Aviva, who is here tonight and is going to be taking us through a fantastic conversation about ways to engage in the curriculum in a different way than perhaps using the checklists provided in our curriculum guides. So Aviva, I'm going to hand things over to you. And again, any troubles, folks, just let me know in the chat.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks everyone for coming tonight and joining in on this conversation on moving beyond the curriculum checklist. On this first slide here, you'll see all of my contact information as well. So if you have any questions afterwards and you want to contact me to find out more information, by all means. I do respond to all of my email, or you can catch me on Twitter as well. And I've also added in my professional blog too, where I do try to share fairly regularly on some of my thinking on different things that are happening in the classroom as well. For those people that don't know me, I am currently a grade 1 teacher at Dr. Davies School in Hamilton, Ontario. I did teach grade 5 last year at Ancaster Meadows, so I've changed schools since then. And I basically, in my 14 years of teaching, taught everything from kindergarten up to grade 6, with a large majority of my time spent between kindergarten and grade 2. So my heart is definitely in primary, and I love being back in primary this year, and I'm loving my new experience at a different school with a different group of students and different needs. But I've also really enjoyed my time teaching junior, and I think that some of those experiences have now helped me out as I move back down to primary. And I've tried to kind of incorporate a number of ways today for you to share some of your experiences. I know there's lots of people here who've already done lots of different things and have other things to contribute. It's awesome to have so many people that I follow on Twitter in here tonight too, so I'm really, really pleased that so many people have come. But if there's another time in which you want to share some of your experiences or have any questions, please feel free to add some information to the chat. This is really a night about you and about what you'd like to get out of this. So we can always discuss things that you may have by just adding information to the chat box. And I will try really hard to follow along with the chat box as well as follow along with what's happening on the screen too. So here's to moving beyond the curriculum checklist. So to start off, fairly easy one to begin, and I guess we're going to be moving to an ABC one, Louise, if possible, for what division do you teach in. So in a minute, hopefully, it will change over from the check mark to ABC. Perfect, thanks, Louise. And people can now just give you a bit of an indication. If one of these don't fit and you want to add more information in the chat box, you can do so as well. Oh, if you have more than one, if you just wanted to write in the chat box what your position is, that would be awesome. Thanks. Perfect. Oh, it's great to see so many people, different divisions, different experiences, lots of occasional teachers, which is awesome. Oh, a teacher candidate too, fantastic. Perfect. Okay. So I'm guessing most people have answered now, so it looks like there's kind of a mixture tonight, which is great. I've tried to pick some slides and stuff that show the different experiences with my experiences back when I taught grade 5 and grade 6 before, and now when I'm back in primary. But if there's something that you're missing and you have any more questions, by all means, please feel free to just add it in the chat box as we go along. Okay, so then my next question is, when you read the curriculum document to prepare for an upcoming unit of study, what do you look at first? A, the overall expectations, B, the specific expectations, or C, the big ideas? And if you find that it's any combination of the above, by all means, feel free to just add it in the chat box. If not, if you want to use the polling tool as well as a drop-down ABC menu, then you can just let us know. Okay, so big ideas and overall. They seem to be pretty well a tie so far. Awesome. Okay, so it looks like it's largely split between the big ideas and the overall expectations. I'm going to look a little more closely at the overalls just because of the assessment piece with it, although I do think that the big ideas can tie themselves really well into those overall expectations, so there does seem to be a bit of an overlap. But again, if you have some different ideas that you want to share, by all means, we can always add into the chat box as well. So now I'm going to kind of push a little bit with that idea of the overall expectations. And before I get started kind of sharing how I've used them, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you use the overall expectations when planning for an upcoming inquiry. So if you're able to use the text tool, which Louise had shown you before, the big A in the corner, if you want to add some ideas into this text box here on the slide, or if you find it easier to add it in the chat box as well, you can also do that too. So, material. Provocations. So Tamara, when you say to create some final assessments, are you also using it to kind of build up to those final assessments as well? Or is it just in the actual final assessment piece? Like what would you use then for the build up? Oh, awesome. Thank you. Awesome. Should be expected. Awesome. Thanks, Tamara. Differentiate. It's interesting to see the look between, or I guess the overlap between meeting the curriculum expectations as well as meeting student interests, which I think becomes a big topic of discussion when it comes, especially in the full day kindergarten document right now too, where we want to kind of guide with, or we want to lead with the student interest, but we're also feeling the need to meet the curriculum expectations and how we balance both. And the overall expectations are definitely a nice way to do that because they're more general, so we can kind of overlap a little bit of both by looking at what the curriculum is asking us to do, as well as looking at where the student interests lie and seeing if we can come up with a way to meet both of those ideas, because we want students to be engaged in the classroom, but we also want to ensure that we meet the expectations so the students also have the prior knowledge that they need to move on to those next grades and stuff as well, right? So it is definitely a bit of a balancing act, and tonight's session definitely talks a little bit about this balancing act. And I think right now, I'm going through a lot of the same issues that you are. I'm going to share some of the ways that I've tried to, I guess, deal with some of the issues and the questions and things that are coming up, but this is just me learning too. And one of the reasons I put my professional blog at the beginning of this presentation as well is that I'm kind of constantly reflecting on how things are going and kind of throwing out those questions where I'm not so sure. And Hima's question here about giving grades to grade 1s and stuff, those are the same questions and problems and things that I'm dealing with as well right now in terms of figuring out how it all fits. How do I grade them? How can I use the assessment data that I have collected to help support those? And how do I take that assessment data and eventually provide a final mark, which is something that I have to do as well. So all of these same questions and things that you have indicated here are ones that I'm also dealing with right now. And a lot of the ideas that you've shared here are some of the ones that you're going to see in the upcoming slides, as well as some different ones as well. So with that in mind, I guess we'll move on. And one of the things is, and this worked really well when I was teaching older students, although I still have them do it to an extent with the younger students, just in a slightly different way, is sometimes the overall expectations help us when having students share what they know. This is an example last year when I was teaching grade 5. And one of the problems that I was having was I would give a general topic. So I would say something like, okay, we're going to be learning, in this case, about First Nations people. And I asked students to just share everything that they know, except so much of what they know and so many wonders weren't overlapping with the expectations. So then I had this problem of having all of this information about what they know and what they were interested in, but it didn't really help me in terms of the teaching because I really needed to keep it to a pretty specific area. Now, grade 1 is slightly different because the overall expectations seem to be a little more general. They're not quite as specific as this, where in the case of the topic of First Nations, I was restricted to a very specific time period. So some of the interesting topics for students had to do with what was happening now, and we certainly want students to understand the impact of what happened before and the impact of what happens now, but it doesn't necessarily help in terms of guiding what they already know, as well as some of their inquiry questions that might be coming up. So it was actually two people that are on Twitter. One is Erin Pulley, who goes by Provocation, and the other one is Jennifer Faulkner, who goes by Learning Hood. And they were doing a presentation at ECHO last year, and they actually did this with their group in the presentation. So what they did is they gave the overall expectations, and then they had students share what they know based on those overall expectations, which is exactly what I ended up going back and doing with my group, because I found that my first attempt was far too open-ended. So instead, I gave them the expectations, we talked about what they meant, and then the students went back and they started to write down what they knew, and then they started to kind of come up with some of their questions and wonders that came from there. So the overall expectations guided their initial sharing time. It can also help when it comes to the idea of picking provocations. And especially right now, and this is an example of the grade 1, I'm finding I teach a group of students where a large number of my students are English language learners. They're stage 1 ELL students, which means that even just the background knowledge, the vocabulary that they have in English is a lot more limited. And so I tried to use things like pictures and videos, and it wasn't good enough. The students really needed to have the actual object to be able to see and to talk about, to help build some of that background knowledge before coming up with their questions. And so what we did is I had the students look at some actual objects, and this, instead of just focusing in on, in this case, the social studies area, which was linking to the idea of roles and responsibilities, I instead had the students focus in initially on just naming the objects. So we did it as a writing activity, and we looked at sounding out words and writing down the sounds that we know, but it was linking to the expectations for language, while at the same time helping the students build some background knowledge that would link with the overall expectations for social studies. And that's why I will often look to those overalls first, and then based on them start to pick some of the provocations to put out to hopefully help kind of guide the discussion that they might have, and eventually hopefully help with the idea that their questions and wonders will actually align with the expectations that they're being assessed on later. And this is where we look at a few more provocation options. So this is another idea of taking those overall expectations. And in this case, we were looking at the idea of materials when it came to structures. So what I did here is I kind of set up a situation in these two bins with the hope of students realizing that the structures were destroyed because of the material use that they had. So getting the students to think a little more deeply about the idea of materials and the impact that the environment might have on those materials, so why people might choose certain materials over other ones. Again, looking to those overall expectations helped a little bit with coming up with the specific setup for that provocation, as well as coming up with kind of guiding a bit of the discussion that we had about it later, to ensure that the students were hopefully trying to generate some questions and wonders that would align with those overalls. It doesn't always happen, and that's where I think for me that's often where I have to go back and decide what am I going to do now. And that was kind of the case in this one, because I had thought that the provocation would work out exactly with what I was hoping for, that they would get the idea of the impact on the materials. But in this particular case, and you can hear a recording in this blog post, what happened instead is that the students, they were pretty convinced that it was a fire that had destroyed the house, and everything else was built on the idea of a fire. So while I wanted the students to get to the idea of some natural phenomena and this idea that the environment can actually impact on structures and that the materials therefore matter, they were so kind of linked back to this idea of a fire. No matter how I tried to question them to have them maybe reconsider, they still ended up with the idea of a fire, that I had to go back and I had to kind of reconsider how I was going to help the students see another option. So in this particular case, that's where I needed to really think about the overalls, and blogging kind of helps with that, because when I started to look at it, I realized that even though the students didn't get what I wanted out of the provocation, they did get the idea that materials matter, and that even if it was the case of a fire, the materials themselves that made up the structures would have mattered to if the structure survived or did not survive the fire. So that's where I think we need to know the overalls to know if what the students are thinking, even if it's not what we want them to think, may actually be meeting the expectations, and if we can kind of go with those interests as well, because they are of interest to the kids, and still meet the curriculum expectations. And I think it is often a very fine line here, and it's something that I think we're all kind of trying to figure out along the way. Now, the same can be true when looking at provocations in grade 5. And this is an example of an activity that I did last year. It did align with the overall expectations, and it kind of aligns with one of the ideas that somebody said when they were looking at kind of a culminating task and using the overall expectations to help with that culminating task. This would have been like my example of a culminating task, but one that was done, I think, a lot quicker than some culminating tasks can sometimes be. So in this case, what I did is I set up like a murder mystery. But the idea was trying to figure out who might have murdered this First Nations man, and they needed to use the clues that were there to help determine who might have been responsible. And the idea being that they would have to bring in some of their background knowledge on the topics that we had discussed, as well as they were all responsible for asking a set number of questions and then using the information from the scene as well as their own research to help support their answers. So we really got into the inquiry process as part of this, but instead of having an overall, instead of having a culminating task that seemed to drag on for weeks on end, it was one that could be assessed and evaluated and completed within just a couple of days, which was really good and was still quite engaging, but also matched with those overall expectations. And that's where those provocations were important to ensure that they really got the students kind of devising those inquiry questions and coming up with questions and answers that would match with where our curriculum expectations were. And again, this is another example of grade 5 where the same thing has happened. Now this time, instead of using the overall expectations for kind of a culminating task, this would have been an example of more of an initial provocation, but actually kind of aligns with the one that I had done for grade 1, just with a different set of expectations. So in this particular case, we set up what was kind of like a tornado or a hurricane, and they had to look at the impact of the structures. But this was set up actually by my student teacher at the time, and she set it up in a big bucket in the middle of the floor, you know, put the chairs around, taped things off so it looked like it was really important. And in the midst of doing so, really got the students coming in, questioning and wondering, and then investigating more to find out a little bit more about that natural phenomena. And again, she got the idea by narrowing in initially on those overall expectations and then still looking to the specific ones that are underneath, but using them more as a guide, knowing that if she really focused on that overall, that the students would get to the specific ones that were underneath there. So now I'm kind of throwing it back at you, and I'd love to know what are some examples of ways that you could link provocations to the overall expectations. And maybe you could share even some examples of things that you've done in your own classrooms or things that you would consider doing. And if you want to either add it in with the text tool in this box or add it in the chat window, that would be awesome.
I'm just going to jump in for a second and make sure. I know people are probably thinking, but if you're wondering about the text tool, I think you guys were doing okay on the last screen. Give me a green, oh, let me switch this to green check mark for a second. Give me a green check mark if you guys are hearing okay. Okay, all right, that's terrific. Just needing more think time, no problem. Tanya, I see your question down there about keeping comments in one box. If your text tool is the plain text tool, then every time you hit enter, it's going to, let me just test this out. Yes, every time you hit enter, it will pop down a new line. If you're using the text box, where it's the capital A with some lines around it, it's all going to stay in one box unless you move your mouse and click somewhere else. Then it's going to start a new box.
Oh, I liked your host building one. That's awesome. Do you have an example of one of those introductory activities that you've used to kind of activate the prior knowledge? Like maybe even in this case, because I think so much of what we consider when it comes to provocations, we really are looking at those expectations. Maybe parts of the overall, maybe the exact overall, but we are looking at them. So even just sharing any of the provocations that you've done, just even allow, because there's many of us here with similar grades, give us a chance to see some different things that may even help each other out. And yes, don't worry, there's no rush, and if people still want to, even if we move past this slide, want to add ideas later on in the chat window, that's good too. Thinking time is fine. I like hearing about your math one as well. Oh, that's interesting. Monopoly and integer. Ooh. That would have been fun. Oh, virtual walk. What a great idea. Oh, loans. Oh, Battleship for coordinates. Love that. I remember that takes me back to grade 6. We just did a little bit in grade 6. Actually, I guess it was more grade 5 last year that did it more, although it worked a little bit with grade 6 as well, but needed to be modified a bit. Google Night. These are awesome. Oh yeah, I bet they do look different at the high school level. But I know a grade 8 teacher who even said that sometimes for provocations, it can just be something like a quick video clip or a picture that just gets the students thinking. So it doesn't necessarily need to be like in my example of the grade 1s with, you know, the big box of actual objects, right? I mean, depending on the age and needs of the students. I remember even for grade 5 sometimes that it was just, you know, like a map of some sort or a picture or a quick video or yeah, like a minds on thing, minds on activity. I mean, even that first one, I guess it's not really a provocation because you're kind of giving them, I guess, like you're giving them the expectations. But Erin and Jennifer, the ones I mentioned before, who had given me the idea of using the overall and getting the students to just write down what they knew about the topic and any questions that they had, they did that I guess, as a starting point for their inquiry. So I guess it provokes thinking in terms of them looking at a general set of expectations and trying to share what they already knew and what questions they had, right? So, you know, not necessarily a provocation, but I guess if the idea of provocation is to provoke thinking, then it can be that too. Oh yeah. Thanks, Melissa. It's neat to see too that things are different with the different grades and where these similarities and differences overlap. And I honestly think sometimes the differences also come depending on the students themselves. You know, my current needs of students make some of the more abstract provocations harder for them because they don't necessarily have the background knowledge for it. So they need to be able to like touch it and experience it more, where other students I've taught in the past are fine with looking at a picture or a quick video or just, you know, a quick image of something and they can quickly come up with different ideas. So I think sometimes it's the students that can lead to it too. Although I must say reading everything that's on this page here makes me want to just screenshot it and hold on to all the good provocations. So it's neat to see the different things that people have and continue to do. Okay, so moving on to this one, and I know we're back in the text tool. If you're having problems with the text tool and you just want to type in the chat box, that works well too. But just before we kind of move on to a slightly different component of this, I guess I would ask, how do you help students develop their schema and gain background knowledge? So thinking after the provocation piece, what do you do to help them gain a little more background knowledge? YouTube, love that. OKWL chart, awesome. I've heard awesome things about Kahoot. I haven't used it yet, but I know a lot of teachers at my school that use it. I really have to check it out. Field trips. Centers. Oh, jigsaws. That's awesome. Okay, so it certainly seems like there's lots of different ways that people here have tried to build background knowledge. Tamara, I don't know the FRIAR model, but I'd love to know more. I don't know if you can type anything in the chat box about that. I'm not sure if other people here know about it, but or if you want to take the mic and explain it for a minute. But FRIAR model. Oh, that would be awesome. Thank you. I don't know if it's something I've heard of before, but just don't know the name of, but I need to find out a little bit more. Okay, so some of these ideas are ones that people have already mentioned, and I'm just going to mention a couple of different resources and things that I've tried before to help build that schema, which I guess depending on what students share after the initial provocation can kind of help us decide how much background knowledge they already have and how much more they may need. So last year and the year before I used Pinterest pages a lot. So basically I created Pinterest pages for the different topics that we were studying. So if we were doing an inquiry, say, on First Nations, I made a Pinterest page and I pinned some different videos, articles, things that would interest the students that would align with the expectations. And so students could use that page to help give a little bit or to help gain some background knowledge on the topic. And I used to just give a very general description that went with each of the things that I pinned so they could decide if that link was right for them. And also tried to pin things that might meet the different learning needs of students, because obviously our classrooms are full of students with various learning needs. So for students that may have difficulty reading text, I try to pin some videos or oral recordings that might help them out, or maybe some simpler text that may make it easier for them, versus for students that kind of really needed either a challenge or were interested in a little more complex ideas, then they may have some text that was a little harder to get at, which might really force their thinking a little bit as well. students didn't need to use the Pinterest pages, and many might start there and then do their own Google searches to gain some more information. But it was certainly a starting point to get them reading up a little bit more on that topic. Thanks, Tamara. And then after using Pinterest for a year, I found out about Naquery. Now, Naquery was created by Brian Aspinall, who's on Twitter as Mr. Aspinall, and he's a teacher in a board. I'm trying to think. I don't know exactly where it is. The name isn't coming to me right now, but what he's done is he's created a website it's similar to Pinterest. It allows you to basically pin items, either images, text, video links on different topics. You can create different kind of bookmark sites. But instead of just having the teacher do all of the pinning, now students can do it as well, and you're not limited to just having an image. The other thing is you can keep these walls or groupings or whatever private if you want, or you can also get a link to post it somewhere. So the ones that I've created, I've used now in grade 1, and I've put them on our class blog so that students or parents can access them even from home if they want. At this point, I've just been the one adding the links, but I've let parents know that if they have any links that they think might be worth adding as well, that they can just send me the link and I'll add that as well. My hope is that maybe as the year goes on, some of the students can start to add their own, or parents can start to add them as we start to investigate some different topics together. I found having something like Naquery or Pinterest is really helpful in the younger grades because some of the Google searching is a little more complicated. So this way I can at least do some of the background reading on the topic and put some information in that the students can really access. The use of real objects works well, and I think somebody else actually mentioned that as too on the page, on our brainstorming page as well. So in this particular case, when we were looking at materials, we were looking at which ones absorb and do not absorb water, and initially I just made a provocation much like this, and students made some predictions about what they thought and what we might be able to do with it, and then we sat around and we tested things out. And then based on what the students figured out, it made them think a little bit about, oh, well, if I spilt water everywhere, what kind of material might be best for me to grab to clean it up? Or if I'm creating something that's going to be in the water, what kind of material should I consider using or not using? Why, do boats or whatever, why are they made with certain materials instead of with others? So all of a sudden, by being able to experiment a little bit more, they were able to draw a few more conclusions and again, gain that background knowledge a little bit. And sometimes it can just be in observing and thinking that they can help build a bit of schema. So this was an idea that was actually given to me by Jonathan So. He's Mr. So Classroom on Twitter. He's a grade 2 teacher with the Peel Board. And when I was looking at structures, I was trying to figure out about what might make them stable. And his suggestion was that if we put 3 eggs kind of put in like a triangular formation, that it would stack up to something like around 8 to 10 textbooks. Now I didn't have textbooks in the room, but I had these alphabet books, so I put them on. But if you just use 1 or 2, it doesn't actually spread out the weight enough to hold the books up, and they end up falling down and the eggs might break. So I set this up on the table for the students to look at, and they did a little bit of observing and thinking about what might happen and how we could use this information when designing some of our own structures, especially since we were looking at designing some shelving. So kind of thinking a little bit about that idea of some shelving. And again, these are uncooked eggs, but just kind of spread out in a certain way to really get the students thinking a little bit. And sometimes the same can be done with a video. So in this particular case, and I really wish I remember who tweeted this to me, because he actually tweeted a video, but I didn't want all the content there, so I had to make my own. But basically, I didn't realize this before, but if you squeeze an egg around its shell like that, no matter how hard you squeeze, it won't break. Yeah, I like how they said make sure you're ready with a cleanup plan. I will admit that we didn't have any problems with it. I did make sure that it was in the middle of a table where things really wouldn't get knocked down. In the case of this, I actually recorded a video for fear that if the egg actually broke, that I didn't want it all over the classroom. Yes, and it is true, you have to squeeze with your whole hand. But the LLI teacher in our school was awesome enough to record, and it took like about 8 different tries because people kept talking in the background in the staff room, but managed to get it so that we could record about a 15-second video for the people to look at, to give them a little bit of an idea about what would happen if you did squeeze the egg and what that might mean. So again, letting the students build some background knowledge by watching the quick video, talking it out, sharing ideas with each other, and then coming up with some new information of their own. And sometimes it's the real objects, and this was the case last year in grade 5 where we were learning about some issues, and I basically collected newspapers. And yes, despite how much I have available online, I am a huge newspaper reader, and I do get 2 to 3 newspapers delivered every day, and collected them and brought them in. So same articles discussed in different newspapers, and the students were able to actually access the content by reading through the newspapers together. It was interesting to see for many just how difficult it was to actually open up a real newspaper. I don't think many had used it before, but and you can see that some are actually some are actually accessing the real newspaper, and some were actually using it online as well as writing some of their notes online. So anyways, and then this was a case of my vice principal who was actually sitting there with the students on the floor, Christy, and she was actually asking them some questions to kind of get them to dig a little bit deeper too. So I think that questioning piece also comes along with it. As we're building that background knowledge and building that schema, it's nice to have those questions to kind of push that learning forward. And it was great last year when Christy, and sometimes my previous principal at the time, Paul, would also come upstairs to the classroom and would ask the students some questions to kind of help develop that schema. My current principal and vice principal as well are awesome at that, and they'll also come in and visit the class, and they'll talk to the students. And often the questions that they ask will help kind of develop that schema, build some new understanding, and help the students draw some conclusions. I think that someone may have asked a question. Hester, do you have recordings during this time? Recordings of what? Like recordings of when they're questioning out loud? Well, it depends. Were you looking for this specific example, or are you just asking me if I would record? In this particular case last year, I had taken a photograph of this one. What he had done is the person who's actually typing on the iPad there was actually writing down some of their notes, and that got submitted to me. For me right now in grade 1, I would probably be going around with my iPad and recording some video discussions as well as getting the students to draw or write some ideas that could also be photographed to kind of capture that. You would. I do think having some recordings is awesome. It's nice to have those discussions. Last year when I was using, like when the students had devices, like in this particular case, that was the student's own iPad. So I think with the recording piece, it's awesome when you have enough to kind of spread them out and get the students to use like a podcasting tool so you can hear the conversation that's happening. What I tried to do was kind of go group to group and get kind of involved in that conversation. And when I did, I tried to podcast the discussion that we had. But ideally, if you can get the students to podcast some of their discussions, it's great. It's awesome for formative assessment, and certainly gives you an idea of who's sharing what information from there. Yeah, and with technology for sure, with they don't necessarily need to be writing to share it. This year our school is, I'm in a grade 4, well I'm in a K to 8 school, but the grade 4 to 8 students are involved in our board's TLE project, which is Transforming Learning Everywhere, and it means that they have one-to-one iPads. And so one of the things that comes with the one-to-one iPads is there is a selection of apps, and Explain Everything is an app that's used quite regularly. It's a screencasting app. It's fantastic. It is a paid one. There are some free screencasting apps that are also really good. But this particular one I think is fantastic because it allows you to even write and record right on top of videos and pictures. And in all honesty, if all of those students were taking their notes in some kind of screencasting app like that where they could be recording their discussion as well as sharing and writing down what they've done and then sharing that with you, you would really have this amazing picture of what the students know, what they don't know, and where you need to go next. And if they were, as these grade 4 to 8 students actually quite honestly usually are, recording their stuff and then using, we have Google Apps for Ed for our board as well, so they're actually able to take what they've recorded, upload it to Google Apps, and then share it to the teacher, then that teacher is actually able to hear their full discussion of what they're doing. And I know, for instance, that we have a grade 5 teacher, well, we have a number of grade 5 teachers for sure in our school that are doing that right now, but honestly, most of the grade 4 to 8 teachers, at least to some extent, are doing that exact same thing. So this could be done where basically you've got that anecdotal record and you've got that recording and you've got that written down notes of what's being shared for the times that you can't necessarily capture. And yes, absolutely, Hester, it totally allows you to focus on everyone else. Plus, it allows you to capture some of your discussions, but know that what's not being captured by you is being captured by the students, which I think is really powerful, right? Right now, in my grade 1 class, for instance, I don't have one-to-one iPads. The iPads that I am using in the classroom are my own, and it's kind of a mixture of different ones. Some of them are version 1, some of them are version 2. I have a few iPad minis, so it's kind of a eclectic mix, as well as we do have some for our grade team that I will sometimes borrow, but as I said, I do have some of my own, and the other grade 1 teachers don't necessarily, so just to kind of spread things out and allow us all to be able to have access to some means that I don't necessarily have the same tools available on all of the different iPads, and so as such, sometimes I can use a tool like Explain Everything and sometimes not. And sometimes, and I've blogged about it, sometimes I've chosen not to. My grade 1 students right now, sometimes I find it more frustrating than not to use some of the tools. Honestly, I think sometimes just the picture and the video camera are the ones that seem to be the best and easiest for them to use, and sometimes with some of the tools they might get more held up just on the type or color of marker to use versus the information that's being shared, right? So again, I mean, the tools are awesome and certainly allow us to capture a lot of the learning that's happening in the classroom, but it really is picking the best tool for that student at that time, and that may vary depending on student needs. Okay, and one of the other ways sometimes that we can help build that schema is in making connections. And sometimes those connections can be with something like physical literacy. So for instance, when it came to the idea of structures, one of the ways that we were able to make connections was for the students to use their own bodies to create structures. And one of the phys ed teachers at my school was awesome. They're both fantastic, but I happened to have tweeted out that I was looking at the idea of yoga for structures, and Frank took up on it right away, and he actually did a whole yoga thing with my grade 1s to help them understand how to use their own bodies to make structures and how to create stability, and I was able to kind of build on that idea. So for some of them, they really started to understand how structures work and how things stay stable just by experiencing it themselves. And just like with sometimes that idea of physical literacy, the arts can also be really beneficial. Last year in grade 5, when we were exploring the human body, I spoke to our music teacher at the time who took my students for prep coverage, and she actually helped my students explore the idea of found sounds, and they actually, in addition to having to create their own organ system, they also had to create a sound to go with their organ system and then explain the connection. So we actually had a whole organ system display day and people came to visit, but she had the students explore the different sounds and do a soundscape in their classroom, and then they were able to apply it and record one to go with the organ systems that they created and then explain their choice of sounds from there. So again, just giving students different ways to experiment, which I guess goes a lot with the idea from above, Hester's idea even of recording things, is that we need to give students different ways to share what they've learned and also different ways of experiencing the content. And then hopefully with those different ways, every student will be able to be successful with it. And sometimes one of the best ways can be in something like a guided reading group. Lisa Donahue, she's on Twitter, and she also wrote the book 100 Minutes and a large variety of other books. She's been guest speakers at a number of different conferences. She's fantastic. She did this with her grade 6 class last year. So when she was starting with the idea of inquiry, she thought that maybe doing it in a guided reading group might make things a little bit easier. And actually in this blog post that I wrote, I actually mentioned Lisa, and I reference one of the blogs that she wrote as well. So basically what I did is I still did a guided reading group as you would on a specific area, and in this case it was more of a comprehension strategy just based on my students and their needs. But I paired the text with a YouTube video, and then we looked at having students create their own wonders based on the text and a YouTube video and making some of their own connections, and then exploring some topics of interest that aligned with both. So it's still the concept of inquiry, but it allows you as the teacher to have a little more of a discussion with students to help make for some slightly deeper questions, and to help guide students with maybe even some difficult vocabulary and things like that through the guided reading groups. For grade 1, I've done it too, just with the idea that sometimes searching and accessing the content can be hard for our younger students. So having the opportunity to sit with the group and help them maybe decode or understand some of that content, but pairing it with a text that they can decode as well can be wonderful. So it's nice to kind of have that combination. Okay, so now I'd kind of be interested in knowing what you may have figured out or thought about, because I always think it's nice to know what people have thought about. So I was interested now in knowing what are some new or additional ways that you now might consider using to help students gain background knowledge. So what are some things that you might now consider doing to help gain students with gaining some background knowledge? Oh, Pinterest pages. I love Pinterest, but I must admit I think I've changed over a little more to a query, even though I do love the Pinterest ones. I like the fact that in the query ones don't need the image there, but also because Brian is on Twitter and he's a teacher and he's kind of started this up on his own, so he's really open for feedback. He's looking to make improvements and things right away. It's awesome to be able to just tweet him and say, you know what, I really wish your thing could do this, and then he's on it. When I started using the query, I said that I really liked the option for being able to basically pin anything even without a visual, but that I wish that it could be put on a blog. Initially, the query, everything was private, and I thought for my grade 1s, the idea of having to log in, it would be such a pain. Anyways, by the end of that day, he had already opened it up so we could get a link that could go on a website. So he's just so responsive to teachers and their needs that I do find myself using his tool a little bit more than I do Pinterest. Oh yeah. I use the taped off area a lot. I also use pylons a lot too. It just seems like it's a little bit special if it's surrounded by pylons, or like caution tape. I have a lot of that too. Oh, awesome. Oh yeah, Google Docs. That's awesome. That's fantastic to hear. I haven't used Google Classroom before. I've used Google Docs, and I use them a lot with my 5s and 6s. Haven't used it as much as my grade 1s right now, but I would love to know a bit more about Google Classroom. Oh yeah, family photos. That's an awesome idea. Thanks, Tester. Okay, being a bit cognizant of the time, I'm going to flip on to the next page, but please feel free to keep adding ideas into the chat box as well if you want, or even adding some of your own ideas too. Okay, so now comes the fun part, assessment and evaluation. How do you assess and evaluate overall expectations, especially with regards, and in this case I'm going to say with regards to inquiry. So basically, how do you assess and evaluate inquiry? Let me put it that way. I agree, Tanya. Your idea here about giving students a chance to talk makes me think about the challenge game, which was something that my VP last year, Christy, had taught to me, and we basically used throughout. I still use it with my grade 1s this year, but instead of having students almost like engage in a debate, it's similar, but the idea being that somebody suggests a theory or something that they've done, and everybody else is only allowed to ask them a question in response. And the idea being that those questions will start to poke holes in their theory and make them kind of reconsider some of their thoughts. As I said, it seemed to work really well with both my grade 1s as well as with my 5s and 6s. I do have a blog post on it, so I'll see as people are adding some ideas here if I can locate the post on challenge and throw it in the chat box. But it is really good for getting students to talk. I used to do it a lot with just kind of like a one-on-one or two-on-one two-on-two kind of discussion last year, but I would also suggest in the younger grades maybe considering like a bigger group idea for challenge, because I do find it a little bit here. I do find it a little more difficult to do with just a one-on-one kind of situation. Okay. Here we go.
Aviva, I noticed Hester's comments a couple up there, and I'm just wondering, I was thinking, how could you encourage a little more thinking in the self-assessment?
Well, I honestly think when it comes to the self-assessment parts, the more that they do it, the easier it is, and that the more that we conference with them afterwards, the easier it is for them to get a better idea in terms of where they're really at. I did self-assessments a lot last year. In fact, even every final evaluation that I did with a rubric, I actually had the students do their own evaluation first, and then I went back and assessed or evaluated on the same rubric. And even when just doing an assessment piece, I gave the students a few little guiding questions and I had them answer them. I got them to choose the format that they wanted to answer in. I think that sometimes helps too, because sometimes our struggling writers will be reluctant to share as much because they don't really want to write it down. But if they could record a video or a podcast or something sharing their ideas, then all of a sudden you're taking that writing component out and they might be a little more willing to get into some of that deeper thinking. I also think the modeling piece can help as well. We really need to model it out. And in fact, one of the ways that I found that the students all of a sudden started to do a lot better at the assessment piece was when I actually modeled my own assessment for my learning skills. So I wanted the students to do their own, to basically write their own learning skills comments. And we wrote some strengths, weaknesses, and next steps together, and then I was going to get the students to write their own. And what I did is I did a think aloud to model my own and talked about the marks that I would give, but also about the comments that I would have and where my strengths lay and where I was weaker. And I think them getting a chance to see that we could kind of honestly reflect on ourselves, I think gave the students a chance to be a little more honest in some of their reflections too. Okay, so there's some stuff here. I'm hoping with Hester that helps a little bit too. I see some different things here. I'm kind of trying to read and talk at the same time. But if I go on and you have other questions or anything, please just post them in here or grab the mic and we can go from there as well. Okay, so I think the hard part when it comes to inquiry and assessment is that idea that we are really searching or looking at assessment and not just the evaluation of the final product. So one of the things that I find is really helpful is the photographs. And I do a lot of photographs with text to start. So that's where I tend to use Twitter kind of for that purpose. So basically every day I'll tweet out photographs of things that the students are doing, and in my tweet part I'll talk a little bit about the strategies and things that they're using for it, and then I put those together in a daily shoot post that goes on the blog so that the parents that aren't following me on Twitter can still see what's being shared through the blog. Now, the bonus in terms of that is that over time I can see the growth of the students, and the parents can also see the growth of those students. And I can look back and see where the students were doing really well and where some of their areas of need are, so they can start to plan accordingly. Explain Everything is also an app that I talked about before, and it also does well. I think it was actually Hester who had talked a little bit or asked a little bit in terms of students kind of recording some of their own discussions, and this is something that I found kind of helpful. So in this case, we were looking a little bit at structures, and this particular student, he chose to kind of write down some of his ideas. Other people chose to orally record it. But again, I could hear and see some of the thinking based on what the students recorded and wrote, and sometimes did both at the same time. And then that could be shared as well to kind of hold on and show me what they already knew, and again, where we need to go next. Video recordings are also really helpful. In this particular case, the students were working on designing houses. It went with our day of the Three Little Pigs Meet the Big Bad Blow Dryer, and they got to design the different houses to go for the Three Little Pigs houses, depending on which group they were in. And then what we did is after we tried out the blow dryer in each of the houses, the students reflected a little bit and recorded a video. And the videos that are there, they do go in the Daily Shoot blog post. You can see all of them as well. But that kind of shows me again where their thinking is at. So what do the students really understand well, and what are some areas where they're struggling a little bit, and what can I do to help them with those struggling areas? And that kind of takes us to making changes based on assessment. Okay, and I'm just going to stop before I go too much farther because I think Hester raises a really good point. So, okay, in our board, the students all sign off on video and picture permissions, and I talk to the parents about how I plan on using it. I do have one student in my class whose parents have asked that I not record her. Now, they're fine with me recording her thinking. They're fine with me doing an audio recording. They just don't want a picture. So in this particular case, what I do is I just record over top of her. So I make sure that I'm always either standing and just showing her work, or I do podcasts to avoid the video recording. What I do is if students are sharing anything where I think that it would cause a problem, so maybe it's something where the answer is like blatantly wrong, maybe it's something where it's going to be very apparent where the student's needs are as compared to another student, I would hold on to that documentation on my own. I use Evernote. I have it for me, but I wouldn't post it in our Daily Shoot post, so it's not one that's shared with everyone else. When I do record videos of students, if I call their name, I don't show who they are, so I just would point, like I would basically just be showing their work but not them, or I try to just point to them to have the discussion with them without actually calling their name to go with it. So I try to really not match the faces with the names and the video all at the same time. But I do think that the key is letting parents know how you plan on using it and making sure that they're comfortable. And if they're not, then I share it in a different way. It doesn't need to be posted for everyone to see. That's fine. Most parents, honestly, I think appreciate the fact that they can see what their child's doing in the classroom. I hear that far more than anything else, and I share with the parents in the beginning of the year the things that I've done before so they kind of get an idea of how it's being used. But again, I totally respect the idea that people may feel differently on it, and if they do, I could certainly even just email that directly to the parent but not share it as part of our class one. It doesn't need to be shared in that way. It can still be held on for me. I think the key, no matter which way you're trying to share it, is that it's really about making changes based on that assessment, right? So in this particular case, this is a snapshot from one of my blog posts from last year that I did. And the idea being that I had already kind of set up, based on the overalls, my different assignments for this government unit. I kind of knew where we were going and I was feeling really good about it. But then all of a sudden what happened is I noticed that the last activity that I was going to do, the students, because of where they had taken the one before, had actually kind of already met those expectations. So a large percent of what I was going to be doing already, the students didn't really need to do. But there was a portion of it that they did need to do. They really needed a chance to A, create some more questions that connected with those disciplines of thinking, and B, really look at the idea a little bit more of the stakeholders involved. So what I did is I went back and I actually changed the final activity that we were going to do based on where the students' needs were at. And I mean, this is just one example, but the purpose of the example was that it kind of helped people see that the assessment is great. It's great to collect everything and it's data, right? And in a lot of cases, that's exactly what it is. It's my proof. It doesn't surprise me, but it's there as proof. But that being said, there's many changes that I also make because of that proof, because of what gets collected day in and day out. And again, there can be more changes based on assessment. So one of the things that I had come up with was that idea that for a lot of my students, one of their areas of need was in counting. And while they had really good like discussion points when it came to ideas of numbers and number sense. They were really struggling with the actual knowledge base of doing more counting, so they needed more opportunities. And so because of that, that's when I created this whole idea of a classroom inventory to get the students counting more and get them counting in different ways. And so this change led to them counting the different objects in the classroom, and this was just one of the examples in terms of what they actually counted. And eventually, what it leads to is that after we've done all of that different assessment that's happening in that ongoing sense, then comes the idea of, well, how are we going to give them a mark? And so that's where the rubrics kind of help. So it's hard because everyone's doing something different often when it comes to inquiry, but we're supposed to create like one kind of rubric for it. So what I've attempted to do is create rubrics that align with the overall expectations. So what I've got here is one of the examples, which Lise has put in the chat box, of one of the rubrics that basically it breaks it down: knowledge, understanding, thinking, communication, application. That's how I break down even an inquiry type of rubric, but breaking it down based on the overall expectation. So even if their activities are different, it doesn't change those overall expectations, which is what they're being evaluated on. And sometimes the rubric can even evaluate the process. So it doesn't need to be this huge culminating task. And that's what makes inquiry kind of interesting, is that we can still have students evaluate themselves on that whole process. So in this particular case, this PDF is one for that murder mystery that we had done. And what you're going to see here is you're going to see a student blog post sharing what she thought. You're going to see a Storify story kind of putting together all of the pictures, videos, pieces of information, student work samples from this murder mystery, and then you're going to see the rubric. And this whole activity, this whole, like, if you want to look at it as a culminating task of sorts, was actually basically like 2 to 3 days that came together. And in fact, what they were really responsible for at the end is we basically did a press conference on this internet radio station called 105 The Hive, so people could listen in if they wanted. We did a press conference, and every group got to share who they thought had committed this crime and why, and they could ask each other questions, so it became a little bit more of the challenge game, which I had shared about before. And then the students evaluated themselves based on what they shared. So nothing was handed in to me. There wasn't a big writing component. I had conference with the different groups throughout. I had lots of pictures, as you can see in the Storify story. I collected lots of data. I talked to the individual students, so I knew what each individual student had contributed. And on the radio show, which I recorded, so I had a podcast of at the end, I also know what each individual student shared in that case. But instead of having a huge project to mark, basically what they shared on that radio show gave them their final mark for this activity. And this is this whole idea of self-reflection, which I know came up before. So sometimes we can reflect and just share our learning as well as share some of the questions that we have. Now, this is where I think something like Twitter can be powerful, because when we share something and we tweet it, which is what I had done last year in this case, this is an example of my VP at the time who read that question or read that reflection and then wrote a question back to the student. And what I did is I handed the iPad over, and even though you see my name on there, my student actually wrote her back. And they actually engaged in a back and forth conversations with questions and tweets going back and forth. Now, if it was just up to me, I may not have necessarily known which question to ask or how to kind of push it forward. But by sharing it with someone else and somebody else asking the question, it just gave a different perspective, which helped give me a little bit more insight into what the student understood and maybe what she didn't. And that's where I think, again, coming down to how we can share thinking in so many different ways. Some students shared it, big old piece of chart paper. cut up, wrote down their ideas, shared it together. One student, the one in the top with the green phone, he actually used Dragon. So he really struggled in writing, but what he chose to do instead is he recorded his thinking and used Dragon and typed it and then edited his work from there and shared it with the picture. Another student wrote it, but wrote it on an iPad, and again, struggled with writing by hand, but when given a device, felt far more comfortable and was able to share more of his thinking in that way. So what are some additional assessment and evaluation options that you might now consider using? And if not ones that were shared here, if there's something else that wasn't shared here that you'd like to share, by all means, you can share it here or share it in the chat room as well. Yes, it is an app. It's a free app for the iPad. The only thing is that it seems to work better for some students than others. But if you have the iPad mini, you may want to consider using Siri, or is it Siri? I guess it is, whatever, because there's a little microphone icon that actually just shows up even in notes, and the students can even just record it that way. I'm assuming it's part of Siri for that. Okay. Well, I think with regards to the technology pieces, I'm pretty clear with the students in terms of the amount of time that they have. So this is where like that talking aloud piece will kind of go. So while I did give students choices, we would usually brainstorm some options together. So what are some ways that you could assess? And knowing that you have half an hour to do your assessment or 20 minutes to do your assessment, and we'd write down some options. And then when somebody said something like, oh, I want to make an iMovie, well, do you think you could make a quality iMovie in that amount of time? Knowing that what I'm looking for is the assessment piece, not kind of the glitz and glamour. And again, kind of going through that piece and having that talk aloud helps. Sometimes what will happen is you are going to have somebody who chooses to try it and then realizes it doesn't quite work and then has another option. But I think that's part of the piece too, is it's almost like you need to get through that little piece of letting them try, realizing it's not the best option, and then going back and trying again. I think that's all part of the learning piece that makes them realize what tools might be best when. Oh, documentation panels, yes. I know the e-portfolio is being used a lot in my school right now in the grade 4 to 8 where they're kind of one-to-one with the iPads. Now the last time I was here, someone had suggested an e-portfolio and actually used Explain Everything to create one for her students. I tried to do something like it with Evernote, but again, it kind of varies. To use documentation panels in grade 1. Kind of a modified version. I've looked at the official documentation panels, like the ones that I've seen in full day kindergarten, and I don't know that what I've done in grade 1 is exactly that. But I've tried to do something kind of similar. And I do have them up on the bulletin boards in our classroom so the students can go back to them. I don't think it kind of follows the exact format of the kindergarten ones. I'm trying to think, because I'm trying to think of the blog where I've seen someone post. It might have been Jocelyn Schmidt who had posted one that showed the documentation panels like really well in full day kindergarten. I think, was it Carolyn here who said, we use documentation? No, Tanya. I don't know if you have an example of one, Tanya, that you've used for kindergarten as well, just to show the documentation panel. But the way I use them is probably more modified. Yeah. Oh yeah, the D2. Yeah. It is. I know we use D2L as part of our board as well. I haven't looked at the portfolio part from there. Yeah, Jocelyn I think has a good one. I'll see if I can kind of post a good picture of one. I've tried to take some pictures before, but I don't really have the best of luck of getting it kind of close up. But I'll see what I can do to kind of show you an idea of one. No problem. From there. It's true. I think different boards do seem to take things a little bit differently. Just depending on what tools and things they're using. Okay, so being kind of cognizant of the time here, I guess I always like to know that hopefully at the end of a session that people have learned something new that they'd like to either consider trying or at least think a little bit more about. So in the last couple of minutes, I just thought if there's something new that you've learned that you might like to plan on trying, and I'll put this with my next question, which was also any other questions, concerns that people still have, anything if you want to put them in the box so that we can share. Sharing. Awesome. Oh, sock puppets. Yes, I like that one. Oh, thanks. While people are putting some thoughts and things down there, I did find the link for the ePortfolio app, so I dropped that in there. I did a quick search to see if there was some information on OSAPAC, the Ministry Licensed Software site that kind of disseminates all that information, and I